Now I want to introduce our panelists. It really is an extraordinary gathering of people to talk about a very timely topic. And they'll all be coming up these steps here and going around to be seated. And both Doug Wilder and Gwen Ifill will be on the first panel and the second panel. So the first panel, starting all the way going around to your right, is Professor Elizabeth Marin. She's Boston University School of Journalism, and she's done a great job, a series of articles about women, Latino women in gangs. Next, very glad to have a dear friend who has done an incredible amount in the scholarship and has particularly been a persistent critic of the policy of locking up more black men, a professor now at the Brown University. He's the Merton Stoltz Professor of the Social Sciences and Professor of Economics. Please welcome Professor Gwen Loury. A remarkable journalist, author, managing editor of Washington Week, senior correspondent for the PBS NewsHour, and the best-selling author of The Breakthrough: Politics and Race in the Age of Obama that came out 2 years ago, and she'll be signing copies at the end of the program. Very happy to have her here, and I always mention her father was an AME bishop, and I keep saying she's going to be one. She says, no, my life is set. I'm good. I'm good. I'm good. But very, very glad to have her come here and be with us. Please welcome Gwen Ifill. It's impossible for me to say everything I want to say about this great man, a man of the South, a remarkable public servant, the first African-American governor since Reconstruction, and then, when he had nothing else to do, became the mayor of the city of Richmond. Is a remarkable person who, in a very tough state, turned things around, and we are forever grateful for his leadership. He set the high water mark that opened up doors for so many others who have been successful in politics. So he was the pioneer, and I'm so pleased that he was able to be with us today here at Martha's Vineyard. Please welcome Governor Douglas Wilder. And next, a very published and scholarly expert on these things we'll be talking about today. Dr. Mark Lawrence McPhail is the Dean of the College of Arts and Communication at the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater. He's also worked at Southern Methodist University, Miami University of Ohio, the University of Utah, Wayne State, and it's also published a couple books that I mentioned before that we'll be talking about as well, Zen and the Art of Rhetoric. Please welcome Professor Mark McPhail. And finally, on this first panel, we're very happy to have a remarkable columnist for the New York Times, and all of us were just heartsick when Bob Herbert retired, but this brother hasn't missed a beat. And I want to read his background. I've been teasing him about this all weekend, because he joined the New York Times in 1994 as a graphic editor and quickly became the paper's graphic director. He held that position for 9 years. He became the paper's design director for news, and then went to became the art director of National Geographic magazine. And now he writes a remarkable column every week in the New York Times. Please welcome Charles, Can You Hear Me Blow? And so this is the first panel, and to put this in context, I wanted to, you guys, it'll be right behind you, show you 3 short clips. You remember the first one, you remember all 3 of them. One's 2009. President Obama got involved in the Henry Louis Gates matter, and remember Glenn Beck responded to it. The second happened a year later. Remember Shirley Sherrod from the Department of Agriculture? and how her remarks were completely mischaracterized. And the third is about a 4-year-old African-American child in Chicago that was on TV just a week ago, and see how the press plays that. But this is the issues of race in the media in the 21st century. So are we ready backstage? Show these 3 videos.
What's been reported, though, is that the guy forgot his keys, jimmied his way to get into the house. There was a report called into the police station that there might be a burglary taking place. So far, so good, right? I mean, if I was trying to jigger, it's been reported at my house now, so we probably wouldn't have. The guy forgot his keys. But let's say my old house in Chicago, jimmied his way to get into the house. Here I'd get shot. There was a report called into the police station that there might be a burglary taking place. So far, so good, right? I mean, if I was trying to jigger into, well, I guess this is my house now, so we probably wouldn't have it. But let's say my old house in Chicago. Here I'd get shot. But so far, so good. They're reporting, police are doing what they should, there's a call, they go investigate what happens. My understanding is, at that point, Professor Gates is already in his house. The police officer comes in. I'm sure there's some exchange of words, but my understanding is that Professor Gates then shows his ID to show that this is his house. And at that point, he gets arrested for disorderly conduct. Charges which are later dropped. Now, I don't know, not having been there and not seeing all the facts, what role race played in that, but I think it's fair to say, number one, any of us would be pretty angry. Number two, that the Cambridge police acted stupidly in arresting somebody when there was already proof that they were in their own home. And number three, what I think we know separate and apart from this incident is that there is a long history in this country of African Americans and Latinos being stopped by law enforcement disproportionately. And that's just a fact. As you know, when I was in the state legislature in Illinois, we worked on a racial profiling bill because there was indisputable evidence that blacks and Hispanics were being stopped disproportionately.
This president, I think, has exposed himself as a guy over and over and over again who has a deep-seated hatred for white people or the white culture. I don't know what it is. You can't say about white people. David Axelrod's white, Rahm Emanuel's his chief of staff are white. Well, I think 70% of the people that we see every day are white. Robert Gibbs is white. I'm not saying that he doesn't like white people. I'm saying he has a problem. This guy is, I believe, a racist.
The first time I was faced with Do you denounce, in the way you ask the Tea Parties to denounce racists within your ranks?
Yes, we do. We repudiate racists within our ranks.
Near this point at 4:30, more gunfire has captured a busy night in the city, including the shooting death of a 16-year-old.
And that gunman remains on the loose right now. This shooting happened just before 10 o'clock in the 3700 block of South Albany. Police say a 16-year-old boy was shot to death in a drive-by. The victim's identity has not yet been released.
Meantime, 2 teenagers are wounded on the city's south side. It happened at East 74th. There's an 18-year-old man and 16-year-old girl were hit while standing on the sidewalk. Male's in good condition while the girl's expected to recover. And kids on the street as young as 4 were there to see it all unfold and had a disturbing reaction.
Oh, I'm not scared of nothing.
When you get older, you gonna stay away from all these guns?
No.
No?
No.
What do you want to do when you get older?
We'll have me a gun.
Because I live right here and I don't want none of my family members to get shut up.
That is very scary indeed. So far, no suspects are in custody.
Boy, that's what I like to hear. You ain't scared of nothing. Damn. When you get older, you gonna stay away from all these guns?
No.
No?
No.
What do you want to do when you get older?
We'll have me a gun.
You are? Why do you want to do that? You know what you have to...
I'm gonna be the police.
Okay, well, I'm not gonna even have.
Oops.
We see. Hello, hello. Testing. We see how journalists use the issue of race, and that the last one is particularly disturbing. And most of you, everybody knows, the full Shirley Sherrod tape, which was more than an hour, explained that those were her former views and how she's changed. And in fact, there was a great interview by a white farm family talking about how much she'd helped them after that. But she had to pull her car over, I think she's in Virginia, and text her resignation. We got to get this off the front table. Her first critics, Roland Martin, African-American reporter, and Ben Jealous, NAACP president. And so there was no, you know, the whole idea is that we criticize racism, whether it's black or white, it's wrong. And this 4-year-old kid just breaks my heart. How could you even show that video and not say, yeah, I want a gun, I want to be a police? It's just the opposite of what they conveyed. So, Governor Wilder, you're the senior person here. Does any of that surprise you? That's a term of endearment. Any surprises?
No, no surprises at all, Charles. Unfortunately, the media is supposed to be in an eternal search for truth. Obviously, that wasn't the case back behind us when you saw that went on. Several troubling things. The media has its job to do, but we have our job to do. And when you point out in the Shirley Sherrod case what did take place and how she was criticized, they likewise had a responsibility to search for truth. Give Shirley Sherrod a telephone call. Ask her, what did you say, Ms. Sherrod? And see, she could have told him. Secondly, the more troubling one, as you point out, with this youngster. Talking to a 4-year-old kid or an 8-year-old kid or a 9-year-old kid or anyone under the age. It's against the law anywhere else. You don't put my kid on television and ask him anything. And those persons should be handled for that. You can't get away from that. And so I think, in conclusion, and I know Gwen is going to chime in because she can, but we have a responsibility to make the media more honest than it is. And we can only do that by asserting that they speak the truth and tell the truth and demand that they do so. And I think those several things up there, particularly the last one with this youngster, that helps. Rather than to hurt us, it helps us because it shows you how far sometimes they will go.
Gwen Ifill?
Where to begin? I begin by speaking to some of my pet peeves about this. One is who is a journalist and who is not. I'm not going to explain Glenn Beck to you. He doesn't do what I do. He's not a journalist. He's a person of opinion, and he's allowed to say whatever he wants to say, and if you don't agree with it, that's fine too. So we're going to set him aside. The issue of the little boy, it was certainly bad judgment to interview a little 4-year-old without a release from his parents, but it's not against the law. It is a matter of judgment on the part of the people who put it on the air, and the same judgment should have allowed the entire clip to show, obviously. I don't think anybody disagrees about that. The Shirley Sherrod question was a question in which everybody was covered in mud. No one was covered in glory. The administration didn't react the way they should have, which is listen to the entire tape and review it before they decided to fire her summarily. Many people in the media, and I use the term media, by the way, as separate from journalists, because they don't always do the same thing. Al Sharpton's in the media, but he's not a journalist, and he'd be the first one to tell you that. Jon Stewart's in the media, but he's not a journalist, and he'd be the first person to tell you that. But a lot of people shot before they asked, before they reported, before they thought it through. And that's why you had a lot of people, including the head of the NAACP, condemning this woman without doing their reporting. People in the administration condemning. So this wasn't just a media screw-up, even though it was clearly a screw-up. The one thing I think that the media did do in the end was to tell the full story, which is where else would you go to get it? So even though it took its time, I think the role of journalists in getting to the bottom of this, we were redeemed. The question of what happened with Professor Gates is way more complicated, because I think if you sat the president right now, poured him a beer, and said, do you wish you'd said all that day in the East Room of the White House, he would say he wished he kept his mouth shut. Partly because you heard him predicating his comments by saying, you know, I don't know what happened. Well, that's where it should have ended. Once he didn't know what happened and he started to speculate, and what he also learned from that episode, I think every politician should learn, is that the only thing anyone heard was that he called the Cambridge police stupid. Right. His 1, 2, 3 parts of, well, on one hand, on this hand, on the other hand, which is the way Barack Obama, we've come to see him think aloud, was clearly not all going to make it on the air anywhere or be reported that way. The lead was going to be that he called the Cambridge police stupid. That backfired, and I don't think you'll see that anymore. So when you see critiques of the president, that he is too cautious, that he is too, he holds back, that he doesn't say what you like him to see, that he doesn't come out, you know, guns blazing on every issue. These are the lessons learned from episodes like that. And
I just want to ask everyone to come back to this too, but do you think there is a risk or a calculation of the president being portrayed as the, quote, angry black man, end quote? Is that a risk?
Sure. I think it's a risk for every black man in any kind of position of power or any kind of position. If you drive a bus and someone doesn't pay the fare, and you yell at the guy for about paying the fare, the chances they're going to say, well, he's awfully angry. And that's true if you're the president of the United States, certainly, you know, magnified. But I don't think that's, I do think that people ask a lot of the president to speak in an angry and emotional way about issues, which not only is there the angry black man question, but it's not, as far as I can tell, who Barack Obama is. It's never who he's been.
Gotcha. Professor Merrill, let me ask you, you can comment on any of the videos and other issues, but you spoke in a class that I taught this spring on the HBO series The Wire, and what was fascinating was the whole topic about some columns you wrote a few years ago about Latina gang members, the women. And the question is that how did the public receive that? That is, you're trying to give a real sense of here are women organized in certain ways. Did it promote stereotypes? Did it change minds? What do you think?
Maybe a little bit of both.
Okay.
Sometimes I think, because I think that sometimes you can't always change all minds, obviously. But I was trying to write about the broader problem of female juvenile delinquency and to address that, and I found it in particular groups in particular areas in greater numbers. It was a very underreported phenomenon and a growing phenomenon. It was a challenge to report about for a lot of reasons for that, and to try to get it, it was a challenge to find the audience, to find an audience for it as well, same thing.
But you got positive responses from the people who were involved, right?
Gigantically positive responses from people from all, from observers of this behavior, from people who study it, and from many people and from educators and from people within, from the girls. I mean, the girls were, once they got over the fact that I wasn't on television, sorry, Gwen, they would immediately say to me, what channel is this going to be on? I'd go, sorry, girls. They were very, they were very interested in it.
Wait, Professor Loury, let me ask you, you actually wrote a pretty critical piece of the president for the New York Times, and it's quoted at length in my book. But your sense about this issue of race in the media, because in a sense, well, I'll let you say what you had to say, but one of the problems was whether or not you have a forum, are you going to use it for good or for other reasons? You want to say something about whether or not the beer summit was a good idea?
Well, I did write that piece in the Times shortly after the incident. I was critical of the president and critical of the narrative. The narrative, I thought, missed the mark because, with respect, I did not think and do not think that the profiling issue is the main issue with respect to incarceration and race. It is, of course, an issue, but the lack of leniency and the treating with humanity of people who actually have broken our laws, people who are caught up in the drug trade, people who are caught with weapons, people who are at the margins of society and who are hustling, okay? The millions upon millions of people, they're not all black, but they're disproportionately black, who are living in these backwaters of our society and who constitute both our failure and our problem. The lack of being able to fashion a way of dealing with them that respects their humanity, that recognizes that they are connected by bonds of social and psychic affiliation to millions upon millions of others, and that recognizes a collective and social responsibility, even in the wrongful acts of individual persons, when those persons emerge from the backwaters of society, failed by us. That's the problem. So that when celebrity and personality enter into it, in the case at hand, in the person of Professor Gates and his misfortune, and the president's reaction to it, when it becomes a issue of symbolism, as was that beer summit, as the president tried to get himself out of that fix, and when we don't address the structural basis for the larger problem that's affecting the hundreds of thousands and the millions, then I think we've missed an opportunity, okay? It was a teachable moment, but in my mind, the lesson to have been taught then was not about civility or racial stereotypes or whatever. The lesson to be taught was that in the failures that we're observing in our cities of these people who are constituting a problem, I'm talking about public safety issues, I'm talking about crime and lawbreaking, so in that failure, we are implicated, and more is called for from us than simply the brute hand of punishment, okay? Something more is called for from us than that, and a politics that's capable of expressing that is what we ought to be working toward. So that kind of was, I thought it really a shame, a profound misfortune and an irony that here we have an African-American president and an African-American attorney general. And we have this issue of race and hyper-incarceration and excessive punishment and a lack of leniency and a failure to respect the humanity of people who are themselves mainly the losers in our politics. Here we have this issue. And all he can do is a beer summit. He dare not speak to the underlying structural issues. The possibility for reform seems so remote as to be laughable.
Let me ask you a question. You said because he's an African American and we have an African American attorney general, as if that changes things. Let me finish my question.
Well,
let me finish the question.
Yes, sir.
So, does that mean that if you're not, you have a different or less of an obligation, moral, I'm not talking about legal, moral obligation to talk about it? That is, should Clinton or Carter or Bush or Reagan or anyone else take this issue up? I'm trying to understand, is there a special, do you really mean there's a special expectation because we have an African American? Let me tell you the context. Remember, once he was sworn in, his first meeting with his staff, Eric Holder said that Americans are cowards when it comes to discussing race. And he was criticized for that, even though it stuck as a, wow, he's being honest about our problems. So the question is, do we really expect something special or different because we have an African-American Attorney General and an African-American President?
Well, yes, of course we do.
Okay.
Okay, perhaps unfair to them, but of course we do. Okay, and moreover, candidate Obama invited us to expect something differently. He winked at us and he called us in. He beckoned us with the anticipation that there would be something different. But this is not personal. My point is that the constraints on the room for maneuver in virtue of being black, you showed the Glenn Beck tape, right? So the president is susceptible to this attack of being overly solicitous. He could be the food stamp president. He's the, criminal, he's a coddling criminal president. Okay, now that's a charge that could be slapped at anybody, but at an African American, he's especially vulnerable for that, and therefore has to be especially cautious about not allowing that entry. And I find that ironic because whereas we may have invested him with more hopes, his actual capacity to act on our issues explicitly and directly is limited in part because of his blackness. So I speculate in any case.
Okay. Professor McPhail, you've written a lot about this and spoke and taught about it as well, the issue of race in the media, et cetera. What's your sense is this a problem of the magnitude that we filled up Martha's Vineyard High School on a Wednesday afternoon? I mean, why are we talking about this?
I'm reminded of that line from Jaws.
Can you hear him?
I'm reminded of that line from Jaws when Richard Dreyfuss says, "We need a bigger boat." We filled up this auditorium, but we need much more space. I want to follow up with Professor Loury's observations concerning the structural piece, but I think there is also a moral piece. And it is the moral piece that is part of the conversation that we have not had in this country. When Attorney General Holder says that we are cowards in this country when it comes to talking about race, part of that is the fact that we don't really talk about race, and we certainly don't talk about racism, which is a fundamental aspect of our American identity, which runs counter to our professed visions of ourselves. I think the issue here is not whether President Obama made the right comments or not, but I do think that in the wake of the More Perfect Union address, and here I think I agree with you, Professor Loury, that was an invitation to a conversation about race that was transformative. And there has been a deafening silence since. So as we draw the connection between the March on Washington speech, which was not a dream speech, the conversation about the dream had, or the piece about the dream had been articulated earlier. That was, if you watch the speech, you will see that was extemporaneously given. And Taylor Branch's work on this points to this. The work of a number of historians points to this. The speech was a broken promissory note speech. And when President Kennedy met with Dr. King, and Dr. King said, "I want to talk about the things that we need to get done," President Kennedy said, no, I want to talk about the dream. I like the dream piece. And no matter how much Dr. Kennedy pushed to talk about the structural and the moral issues which were at stake in that speech, it was the dream that we have inherited. I would say, and I've written on President, or then Senator Obama's 2004 speech. I was critical of the speech, specifically in terms of his discussions of race, which I think hearkened to misguided conceptions of race. Young black kids don't not want to be white. There are some issues, and there's a lot of research on this. Slaves did not sing freedom songs around campfires. They worked from before the sun rose in the morning, after the sun rose, and if you were caught singing around a campfire, believe me, there was not going to be any kind of a celebration. And the experience, well, not that kind of celebration.
True.
But and the experience.
That bonfire would keep going.
Well,
right?
yes. The experience of African Americans and other groups who have immigrated to this country is very, very different. And drawing that parallel, I think, was a distortion of history. At the same time, When I heard the More Perfect Union speech, I wept. I thought that this was finally the moment where we were going to start the conversation that we needed to have. And now I just have to say, I think it was a broken promissory note.
Thank you. Charles Blow, we could talk about your incredible career, graphic designer, but I'm just trying to understand that the op-eds are just so powerful and insightful and enlightening. What's your sense about the mix? Because no matter what you write, they're going to say, oh, he must be a liberal, he must be a Democrat, or he's supporting black issues, etc. Do you have a difficulty in trying to make sure people hear your message and not just look at your color and deciding who you are as a journalist?
I actually don't put any stock in it whatsoever. And in fact, the concept of, someone spoke before about the president coming across as the angry black man. I think that you do yourself a tremendous disservice when you don't come across as wholly human. The idea that you cannot stretch the breadth of humanity and be passionate or angry on occasion or happy or celebratory makes people look at you with suspicion. You were talking about graphic design. This is a very interesting concept in animation, where people will accept characters when they're full-blown characters and they can tell that they are drawn, and they will enjoy those characters. So you have characters like Bex and whomever else and yelling and screaming. The closer that character gets to looking human, but you can tell that there's something wrong, people recoil and they won't watch it. And I think that same thing happens with people. If you are so close to being whole, but there's something about you that you refuse to give, it makes people recoil in a way because they become suspicious of what they see. And so I try in my writing to make sure that I bring everything that I am to that writing. And that means that I am Southern. I'm the only columnist at the New York Times and probably the Post and the Wall Street Journal too who's from the Deep South. I'm from Louisiana. I was born poor. I grew up poor. My great uncle lived with us. He couldn't read or write. There's this great moment I remember in high school. I was a senior in high school, and I had won my way from this tiny town of 100 kids in the high school to the International Science Fair. I did a science project on why Star Wars wouldn't work. The International Ballistic Program, Star Wars, wouldn't work. And the day before I left, my illiterate uncle was asking me if the cartoons on the screen were people dressed in costumes, because he couldn't understand the concept that they were drawing one on top of the other. And the next night, I was at a dinner at the International Science Fair talking to a guy who said that he was one of the scientists on the Manhattan Project. And I thought to myself, I just left a man who's never seen the world, and I'm sitting with a man who has created something that could destroy the world. And I try to make sure that I remember that all the time when I'm writing, that I am bringing those people into the light, that I am trying to shine a light on people who do not get seen, who do not get heard. That is the poor people, that is children who are abused, that is people who are harassed by the police. Anyone who I think deserves a stage, and they don't get it because I've been there.
Let me ask you. Very much appreciate it. Let me ask you the question about the writing and the issue of race in the media, and it applies to Gwen as well. The question is whether or not you think people have a sense about you. Gwen did a terrific job with the vice presidential debates in 2008, but they're saying, oh, she must, your book was out before or after that? After that?
After.
After, right? Because if you put the book out first.
I hadn't even written it yet.
Right. Oh, you hadn't even written it?
I had not written it.
Well, okay. But you see that, are people looking at you and reading that and saying, he must be black, he must be apologizing for all the things. Do you as a journalist feel any sort of pressure, both of you, from your blackness, gender as well, but your blackness, do people look at that in a different way?
I don't when I'm writing, because I view the writing itself as an immersive experience. I am trying to, you know, my column is a special kind of thing. I'm trying to blend statistics with emotion and develop real characters, and that's a different kind of animal than a lot of people do in newspaper columns. So when I get into it, you know, my son's out there, he'll tell you, I'll be up in the middle of the night, the coffee starts perking at midnight, and I go to sleep about 2 in the morning, so I just close that out. But I do recognize in the responses how conscious people are of race, whether or not they disagree, and they say things about, you know, I have what I call my racist email inbox, and that's everything to, you know, stick to writing about chicken and watermelons to all of that. But it is also the people who tend to agree with you and who write you congratulatory notes because they start their emails with, and I'm a white Southern woman. I mean, and it is invariable. I mean, every column, half of the emails that I get from people who agree, they identify their race before they start to talk to me about the issue, and that has to be because of my race.
Gwen, what about you in terms of how, did you think about it, and does it happen?
I worked for 4 different newspapers before I went into television, and one of the things I miss most about working for print is that nobody had a clue. And so I would talk to them on the phone, and then I would meet them, and they would go, oh. And it gave me just the extra few seconds to get the upper hand. But it also meant that you had to just work that into your thinking. You'd use it as your advantage. I was raised in a household where I always thought race was a good thing. So when people told me they're colorblind, I figured they must be blind. Otherwise, why would they have a problem with this unless they think that race is a negative? And when I traveled the country after my book came out, after the election, after Obama was elected, I found the most interesting response among audiences. Charles is right. They first start by saying, you know, or one of 2 things. It's either I'm white but, or I'm not a racist but, which is always a fun beginning to a conversation. But I also found that, and this is, I might disagree a little bit with Professor McPhail, which is that people were hungry to talk about race. They were hungry to talk about it in a way in which they weren't being judged immediately. Because they felt they knew me, I'd been in their living rooms, whatever reason, they felt like they could safely say the most incredibly crazy, offensive things, but that I wouldn't mock them, that I would listen to them, because my job is to listen and to hear what people are actually saying, not what I wish they would say, because that tells me more about whether it's what's hopeful about our society or what rot is eating in our society. And if I don't hear it, if I don't listen to it, then I come away less informed. If I walk into a room thinking I know what you think already, or I know who you are already, I'm not going to learn anything more. And what I found was that people were anxious to stand up and say things like, if all your people were like you. Well, I'd let them finish the sentence. I didn't let Shirley Sherrod finish the sentence. I would let them finish the sentence and find out where they were coming from and where they wanted to go to. We almost always ended up at a better place. People are anxious to have the conversation. The disappointment that people have in the broken promissory note from President Obama presumes that conversation only has to come from the White House, presumes that a conversation only has to come from elected leaders. I think our responsibility is for us to have that conversation. And if we're disappointed, by what our elected leaders are saying or not saying, what causes they're championing or not championing, they're politicians, people. They have to get reelected to do other things, which may not be precisely what your main concern is.
Thank you. And Governor Wilder, let me, again, I'm not going to use the word experience or even senior.
That's old.
I'm not going to use, definitely not going to use that word. But what are the lessons? I mean, growing up in the South, governing in the South more than once, continue to teach there. Do you see a change in the way the media is thinking about the issue of race? Do you see any positive signs?
I think that people make the media, and I think Gwen hit on a great point, and I think in defense of Professor McPhail, who needs no defense, people don't mind discussing their opinion of race, but they don't want to get to the basics. of race? How did you end up where you end up? Why is your education behind? Or what are the problems relative to your income? Why is the disease? Look, it took me as a state senator to have to put on the books of Virginia sickle cell anemia being covered by state health programs. Now, I had to fight to get it done because people had no idea that it did affect our people disproportionately. And so I think one of the things when I ran for office, particularly in both instances, all of the instances, people didn't know anything about us or me. And they had to become aware of the fact that I am the same person that they are. I don't think any differently. I don't hopefully act any differently. I eat every day. I have 2 eyes and a nose and 2 ears. And to the extent that the color of my skin is different doesn't make me any different. And I think people had to know that. And so once they came to find that, they say, well, you know, this guy agrees with some things that I agree with. He disagrees with some things I disagree with. And so I can do it. Now, the media was not there. The media was saying, oh, this fool Wilder, he's going out there in the Southwest Virginia campaigning for votes and trolling. We might not see him anymore. He might not be coming back down there near Kentucky and Tennessee. Might not see him. I was criticized, Charles, I want to say, by people of color, black people, by saying, why don't you spend more time with us? Virginia has 85% non-black voting population.
Doesn't that answer the question?
I hope it does. And so when I did go out, I found this. And that's why I think there needs to be more relevant discussion, not just race discussion. No one is an expert on race. We start off with that. And yet they'll do it on so many occasions. They'll ask you, they'll ask anyone up here, Wilder, what are the black people going to do such and such a time? And so sometimes we fall into the trap of trying to answer it. I think they are going to do this, thus, and so. But I learned a little quickly on the tree to say this. Well, what are the black people going to be doing? There's one going around the street now. Run and ask him.
Let me turn finally to the future and start with you, Professor Merritt, in terms of whether you think in terms of journalism, and you use that as separate from media, and we use media to be more general, whether there's going to be any change in the way people perceive issues of race or gender or religion. I say that because I've said to some of you, you know, Mitt Romney is running for the presidency, and he's a very talented candidate with his business experience. And yet the whisper is that he's a Mormon. And it's sort of the Bradley effect of he's black. Are people going to, we don't know, right? But she said, are you asking me to speak for all Mormons? No, I'm not. I know you're not a Mormon. Let me be clear about that. But I'm trying to get under it. Are we still going to have the isms, sexism, racism, religiousism, in a sense of people's judgments about politics? And Gwen,
wouldn't it be nice if we were never going to have them? And I wish I had a crystal ball and could say they're going to go away. But I just want to backtrack a little and just to point out, want to stress a little with what Gwen said, which is that, you know, when we talk about the media and journalism, it's a distinction that we maybe make within our industry and our business, but the outside world generally does not. The media is a monster. It's a machine. It's huge. What is the media? And increasingly, even journalism is now an opinion-based institution, whether we like it or not, more and more so. And it's not just Glenn Beck. I mean, obviously it's blogging and it's the internet and it's many other forms of communication that are out there. And I think that's adding to the general sort of confusion that's going on. And also it's not helping clear reporting by responsible reporters. So my job as a university professor now is to train the next generation to look at these issues responsibly and report on them in a clear and responsible fashion. One thing that troubles me about that, and that means context, that means history, That means understanding where they are now and what came before them, and they don't. They have very little understanding. We're talking now about race and media in the 21st century. They're really quite ignorant of the 20th century, so many of these young people. And for instance, the wonderful PBS documentary on freedom writers was screened in my class, and my students were stunned. Really? That happened? You know? They're bright, sophisticated, well-read kids. They're not, you know, they're not all falling off of a suburban, you know, SUV. Many of them have, but not all of them. You know, I mean, some of them have read books, actually.
From the library. You know they're going to quote that in the paper tomorrow.
Shocking. So I think that that's something that concerns me about educating the next generation of journalists very much, is providing context and understanding. It's not as simple. I mean, of course it's history, but it's not as simple as just that. It's really the broader social context. It's going back to what Professor Loury said about understanding the incarceration figures. What does that mean? What does that represent? How long does a defendant spend before a judge or with his public defender? And does that vary with you know, depending on one's race or one's gender or one's ism? Are there different behaviors that are associated because of the isms and so forth? And I guess the more we talk about it, the more we promote the dialogue, the more we try to educate these kids, the ones I'm looking at, these to look at these issues responsibly and broadly, the better we are toward an outcome.
Let me ask you, Professor Loury, and anyone else can respond to this, and then we're going to take 3 questions from the audience. We have 1 microphone up here, so if you're one of the 3 people, come up now. Not 30 of you, but 3 questions. Here's the question, Professor Loury, trying to get a sense of, the young people are educated. I mean, they are in a different way than we were. You know, twits, blogs, texting, I mean, tweets,
tweets.
Twitter, tweets.
Some of them are tweets.
Right. You see, I don't do it. But you see all of that, and so they're communicating shorthand, a whole different language, right? And yet they aren't necessarily understanding, they don't know anything about the 20th century. And let me, in defense of young people who tweet on Twitter, how's that?
Much better.
That's good.
They wouldn't know, they would not know about Bernard Shaw on CNN. They wouldn't know about Max Robinson on CBS, I think it was. Charlene Hunter Gault. They know about Charlene Hunter Gault because she's still doing it, right? Right? But you think of that, and I don't know if Carol Simpson's here, but you know, there's a generation of success, and it's disappeared, and they have no sense of it. I know Professor McPhail has some comments on that as well. But how do we reach this divide so that people will understand that race matters, or is it a lost cause? Is it hard to teach this stuff to a new generation when so many things are coming at them that they don't even recognize that there's nobody anchoring news except Gwen? And no one on the ABC, CBS, CNN, a little bit in terms of the key person. And we took it for granted in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. We don't see it now. How do we get this generation to see that it is a problem, or maybe it isn't a problem?
Well, it's education, I suppose, is the answer to that, and that's our responsibility, both within our homes with respect to our own children, and then more generally in the institutions where we, through our school boards and such, control curricula and all like that. But I don't know that I have an answer to this question of what do we do about the problem of historical amnesia. I did want to remark, however, Charles, on the issue of how things are changing. And I think this is really a first-order point here that race is not going to be what it has been. Okay, the 20th century is over, man. Forget about it. Black and white in America, America is not black and white anymore. I mean, we've had tens of millions of immigrants from non-European sources of origin come into this society since the 1960s liberalization of the immigration laws, and they're fundamentally transforming the issue. Intermarriage and mixed race phenomenon is on a scale unlike anything that we've ever seen before in American society, and they're fundamentally redefining the issue. When the Office of Management and Budget and the Census Bureau decided to check any box that applies rather than having people to fit themselves into the different categories, we discovered that the complexity of identity is unbounded. I look at my own children who are black, quote unquote, but black in a fashion that bears absolutely no resemblance to the Chicago South Side that I grew up with in the 1950s and the 1960s. I mean, they're like boutique black. You know what I'm saying? I mean,
you know they're going to hear that, Glenn.
Well, I don't think they would argue with me about it. My son Nehemiah, that's right, Nehemiah, that's the book between Esther and Job. He's a breakdancing, hip-hop chanting, astrophysics, white fraternity joining, Chinese-American girlfriend having, upper middle class entitled master of the universe. Okay? And black is just one of the things that he is. You know, so I mean, what I'm saying here...
Is that a sign that Dr. King was right? Not the color of your skin, but the content of your... Isn't that moving forward?
No, I think that's the wrong place to go. That's iconography, man. What I'm saying is what that's a sign of is that my wife and I have a very comfortable life, and we live in a very secure community in which our children are able to assimilate into the American dream. And that's true of a sliver of the African American population. But meanwhile, a third, 40% of the African American population languishes, and the background politics are hardening against them. Okay? The legitimacy of race-based arguments on their behalf is vanishing even as we speak. The affirmative action, it's not even an issue. I mean, it's not even worth discussing, in my opinion. Not about the legality, not about Clarence Thomas and the Supreme Court, about the practicality of social mobility, the accumulation of wealth, and so forth and so on. Globalization is running the show here, right? The wages in South Asia are running the show here, and when Michael Bloomberg suggests that the way to fix Detroit is to let anybody anywhere in the globe have a visa as long as they promise to live there, he's already written off the residents of Detroit. No offense to Bloomberg, he's a manager trying to solve a problem. The point is, there's a stratum of African America that I don't think is going to be reachable soon if things don't change, given the course that we're on. That's what I see.
Thank you. Professor McPhail and Charles Blow, comment?
I mean, I think that the last part is the part that registers with me the most and the part that I worry the most about. I mean, if you look at the rates of poverty in America, they have not changed very much since the year Dr. Martin Luther King was killed, and in fact, they are a little bit higher now. It's about 12%, then it's 14% now. If you look at African Americans, that number is much higher, and what has happened is that that elderly people have become less poor, but children have more than double in their poverty rates. And so what I look at is issues like that, and also the fact that we're getting back to a resegregation of public schooling that is almost to the point of the year that he was killed. I mean, the schools became more integrated in the 70s and 80s, and towards the 90s it started to drop off, and now it is dropping like a rock. And so what you see is a real flashback to the 60s without the vehicle to move you out of it, and that scares me to death. If you look, and President Obama's ascension has actually, not for any fault of his own, but hurt that effort in this sense. The Pew Institute did a study of the first year Obama was in office, and they looked at 67,000 news stories. It was 1.9%, but less than 2% of all stories were about African American issues. Most of those stories were about Henry Louis Gates being arrested at his house, and the other were about Obama, the man. So all of the issues, the systemic cultural issues of African Americans vanished. So if you don't have the vehicle to move yourself out of that, and you see trend lines that are moving in the exact opposite direction that they should move, you know, it should cause everybody to sit up straight in their chairs.
Yeah, thank you. Professor McPhail. Then the first question is coming from Charlene Hunter-Galton. We got two other people. We got 3 questions after Professor McPhail.
As a follow-up to that, my work is on rhetoric and race, and I think one of the things that race relations scholars have noticed is that we've moved from a traditional notion of racism to what we call modern or symbolic racism. So we no longer have the situation in the 60s where there was state-sanctioned violence against black people, which allowed for the type of mobilizing that occurred during the 1960s. It was very clear, it was very open, it was very concrete. Now we've moved to a situation where race and racism get caught up in symbolic webs of meaning, but they're still connected to underlying belief structures, and they're still manifest in structural inequalities, but those inequalities become complicated because we can't point to the police implicated, even though, as we see, the police remain implicated. So the ways that we have talked about race in the past have been transformed into ways in which, I think Professor Kennedy spoke about this in his introduction to Lonnie Guinier's book, The Tyranny of the Majority. We have a story about ourselves as a culture. And the best part of that story sees us as committed to equality, to judging people by the content of their character, by affirming ourselves as a more perfect union. And it's a really good story, and it has transformed us in many ways as a nation, but it's not the whole story. And so our lack of understanding of history, of our own history, of world history, especially in relation to race and racism. Race is a construct that has a historical lineage. It is not a natural manifestation of human activity. It has its roots in the writings of particular individuals, including some of the most intelligent individuals in Western history. Hegel, Hume, Verwoerd, Gobineau, all of these people constructed this discourse which frames us in opposition to each other, which makes some of us human and some of us inhuman, less than human, and that we have not come to grips with the implications of that for our conceptions of ourselves, for what it means to be in a more perfect union, for what it means to be an American, for what it means to affirm the most basic principles of humanity, that is the rule of justice, treating each other the way we wish to be treated, and the golden rule, which is basically the same thing. They're two aspects of the same sensibility, one rational, one spiritual. They are the defining characteristics of what we call the social contract, and it is the disruption of that contract by our actual lived historical experience, what Charles Mills calls the racial contract, that will continue to frame our ability or inability to move beyond this. When we come to grips with it, when we are able to speak about it honestly and openly, through all the hurt, through all the trauma, and without compromise, that's when we will move forward.
So we got 3 questions first. Charlene Hunter-Galton, you got the microphone? Yep.
Thank you, panel, very much for this most enlightening discussion. I have been watching the events in the United Kingdom and the contortions that the British media have been going through trying to deal with it. But what scares me to death, Charles, is that in 1968, we had riots around this country, some call them civil disorders or whatever you want to say, whatever you want to call it, and the Kerner Commission blamed the media in part for this taking America by surprise, because there was no one in the media who looked like any of us reporting on the disenchantment that was simmering just beneath the surface in black communities. Now, you alluded to this, Charles. We are seeing fewer and fewer black faces or people of color on television. I don't know why that is. I don't know why anybody isn't protesting it, but there are virtually no people of color either in responsible decision-making positions about what gets on the air or actually in reporting, with some notable exceptions like my good sister Gwen Ifill. So are we going to find ourselves in the same situation as the UK, as we have more and more disenchanted people who are not being served by the government or the media? Because we don't have people who look like Charles Blow and write like Charles Blow and Gwen reporting the story.
Response?
As I look at you, Charlene, who I follow in your footsteps and bow, but I also look at Paula Madison, who's sitting here in the front row, who's recently left NBC News after years as vice president there and is now the driving force behind the Africa Channel. If Paula Madison had not been at NBC News, I wouldn't have been at NBC News. I certainly wouldn't have stayed at NBC News. I say that to say that as wonderful as it is to have us in front of the camera, the decisions about who to hire and who not to hire, who to promote, who not to promote, happen behind the camera by people whose names you don't know, and they are almost uniformly white males. In my experience in journalism, people promote people who remind them of themselves. And that's not just true in journalism, I think that's true in a lot of business. And but this gets to what Elizabeth Marin was talking about, which is the idea of literacy. Until we understand that young people come up to me and say, I want to be on TV, who want to be weather girls, doesn't work for me. If they come to me and they say they want to be producers, or they want to be people who actually shape the news and the news decisions about which stories get written, which stories get reported, that I want to encourage. And that's my concern. I think it's important to have the words coming out of the mouths of people of color, but I also think I want the decisions coming out of the brains of people of color too.
Thank you. Second question.
Hello, my name is Gloria Brown Marshall, and I am a professor of constitutional law at John Jay College. I teach race in the law, and I wrote a book, Race Law in American Society. But my question is about empowerment, because, for example, the book I'm working on now that will be out soon is on black women and the law. And Charlene Hunter Galt, your case with Hamilton Holmes is in the book. In doing my research, I went through all of these newspapers to find information about the black situation, about black issues, and they were from the black press. So I find it kind of, you know, the sense of empowerment of educating the people, those 65, 85% out there, with a press that's been limited when we talk about who's available to speak our stories. And we're always thinking of mainstream press. We're not thinking about the black press. And it's been undermined so much throughout the years. That vehicle now has been lost to us where we can actually tell our stories. And the mainstream press is giving us a few seconds. How are we to bring this, you know, this imbalance? The mainstream press is not going to let us educate and inform the black communities. And the black press has been financially undermined. So what are we to do when it comes to media? We can't just rely on the mainstream press. Are we going to figure out a way to back up the black press so that we can get our stories out there through that venue? What should we do along that line when it comes to race and the media and getting our stories to the people?
I don't want to hog this, but I do have one brief answer, which is we have to create our own. Look at the media universe that we're looking at now. It's not mainstream versus the black press. It's a million different outlets and a million different sliced up ways of telling our story. And to sit back and say, gee, it's a shame that the Afro isn't what the paper it used to be isn't enough. There are so many other outlets.
Right, I want to second that emotion, to borrow a little bit further, which is that right now, as bad as the media landscape may look, and it looks pretty terrible and pretty grim in a lot of places, what is thriving and what's doing well, and you're seeing it in all kinds of surprising places, is community-based journalism. And it is doing and it's self-generating, it's bubbling up from within communities. The St. Louis Beacon comes to mind immediately. And many other similar online community-based publications, some of which then also morph into print versions as well, or into cable versions as well, and other things. But community-based journalism is alive and, I wouldn't say thriving financially, I would say, because there's no model for it yet. But it's one of the good things that's coming up now. So I agree with Gwen. I mean, I think this is a moment to seize the opportunity, to take it.
Yeah, but I mean, I have to say this, though. I mean, it's one thing to say seize the opportunity, it's another one to say who's going to pay for it. Well, there is a dwindling pot of money for journalism, and the days of professionally paid journalists is doing, or in their waning years, it seems, in some cases, and feeling the brunt of that are a lot of ethnic publications.
Yes,
and so, you know, you get a lot of that happening. What's springing up to replace them, I mean, I love you, Bossip, if you're in here somewhere. I love Bossip and YBF and Black Voices, but I cannot click through another Beyonce photo spread. I can't do it. So, you know. I mean, if there's someone who can sit in front of a screen and post 5,000 pictures of Beyonce, you can sit in front of a screen and download the last census report and try to dig through and see if you see something. I mean, there's the same amount of energy in that. So, I mean, I think that there are outlets, but somebody has to, you got to find some money, you have to find some voices, and you have to connect. I actually had a meeting with Ariana Huffman recently, and I was telling her about Black Voices, which is now under her domain. I said, you know, a lot of what we end up seeing on these Black websites is all culture.
Right.
It is either who calls somebody a racist, and is there really a racist, and who didn't serve you in a restaurant, and who called, you know, the flash mob shows up in Philadelphia and all the kids are Black, or they fought on a subway, you know, or it's entertainment. But one of the beauties of Dr. Martin Luther King's speeches was that, first of all, he was incredibly well educated and never ever spoke down to people. And many of those people, I have to assume, were not educated at all. I mean, you know, if my great uncle was illiterate, he remembers Dr. King, he was listening to those speeches. How is he even keeping up with that? And I think he's never speaking down, and he always connects those speeches to economics. So why don't we have voices today who can connect your personal struggle to your pocketbook? Because then you bridge. And if one of these sites can do that with voices that make sense and resonate with people, I think that that brings back a lot of that.
Right.
But it does take money. Somebody has to pay for it.
Final question? Good. Final question?
My name is Vivian Thomas Rankin, human being, by way of Verdonville, Louisiana. If race can be transcended, what would the new nigger look like? What would it be? And I'm talking about the characteristics of this cast. And I'll take your question sitting down.
I'm going to start. I'm a human being most of the time. I have never wanted to transcend, right? So I don't understand that concept. I love who I am. I mean, I've been listening to a lot of James Baldwin lately, and I was listening to this interview he did about his the first book he wrote, and he said he took 2 Bessie Smith albums and a typewriter, and it's all he took to Switzerland. And he wasn't able to finish it in America, and he had never listened to Bessie Smith in America. He listened to Betsy, and what he said was this white place and white mountains and white snow and white faces, and it's only there that he could connect to who he must have been when he was a kid before he took on all the affectations of what America did not want him to be. I don't ever want to take on the affectations of what America doesn't want me to be. I want to be fully me. And I can respect you for fully who you are. I hope that you can respect me, and if you can't, that's too bad.
Thank you very much. And thank our first panel.